Good evening and welcome to all of you. My name is Kaustup Bandyopadhyay and I will be moderating today's Sambad or conversation on scaling up citizen engagement for inclusive urban governance. This is the 11th event organized by Priya as part of its 40th anniversary celebration. This conversation on scaling up citizen engagement for inclusive urban governance is being organized in partnership with Recipient India and Janagraha. We are very much proud to partner with these institutions. A special word of thanks to Preeta Venkatachalam from Recipient India and Srikant Vishwanathan and Srinivas Alavilli from Janagraha, who made this partnership possible. We also have an extraordinary list of speakers who will be speaking today, and I will introduce all of them in a moment. But before we delve into today's theme of conversation, let me first invite my colleague, Ms. Nikita Rakhiani, to make a short presentation on Priya's 40 years of journey with a special focus on the theme, Sustainable Urban Future. Nikita.
Yes, thank you, Costa sir, for this warm welcome. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So it's a pleasure to share about our 40 years of journey with all of you present here. Thank you everyone for joining once again. Priya 40 has been an exciting journey, a journey about sustaining an independent, forward-looking and energetic civil society organization in an otherwise rapidly disruptive and uncertain world. We've always considered ourselves as educators and facilitators. Yes, so we have always considered ourselves as educators and facilitators supporting individuals, organizations, and grassroots initiatives to learn, change, grow, sustain themselves. Such support is not and has never been about financial support. It is support in form of information sharing, in the form of ideas, in the form of linkage building, support through mediation expertise, and even emotional support. Priya's theory of change follows something unique in the development sector, which is acting as a bridge between the supply and the demand side of any issue or theme we invest in. Efforts to mobilize individuals, especially the poor and marginalized sections, but increasingly also the middle class, making them aware of their rights and responsibilities, thus fueling their sense of agency to demand services, inclusion, participation, knowledge. On the supply side, we work with government and private agencies to sensitize them to deliver their mandates and be accountable to citizens. We engage with as many stakeholders as possible to put in place answers which are long-lasting and effective rather than an artificial short-term fix. From the days of newsletters and printed journals, we've moved on to the use of modern technology through our website and social media handles to influence an ever-growing group of people. We can only present a slice of work of what we've done in these 40 years. Priya, and its name, Participatory Research in Asia, owes its birth to the International Participatory Research Network as the main node to expand the nascent field of participatory research in the Asian subcontinent. Priya was initially primarily concerned with building an inclusive knowledge base, along with building the capacities to use participatory research in India and beyond. The guiding principle for this period of Priya's history was promoting the right to learn. That is, making the process of learning available to everybody, irrespective of societal divisions. Priya's first phase also saw a series of studies on the issues of environment, land alienation, rights of women workers, and occupational health and safety. By the 1990s, Priya had established its training of trainers course to impart its participatory learning methodology to grassroots activists, government trainers, and development professionals from different fields. Its participatory training methodology, promoting the right to know, was used to develop participatory assessment for organizational development, participatory evaluation for civil society organization and multi-donor agencies, and participatory monitoring for development projects. Soon, the participatory training methodology included a specific focus on an experiential understanding of gender in everyday life. With a history of promoting and developing capacities in participatory practices, Priya took upon itself the task of strengthening a newly created institution of local governance called panchayats. The right to information for accountability and monitoring and demanding public services became essential. Priya's collaborative approach embraced not only institution of governance, but other stakeholders, such as higher education institutions, supporting them in revising their curriculum and pedagogy to become community engaged, state election commissions and state finance commissions. In 2004, Priya for the first time spoke of people's participation in urban townships, voicing the relevance of participatory planning in urban centers as much as in rural areas. Stress on urban governance led to several research studies, such as analyzing the financial and functional competencies of urban local bodies as institutions of governance. The new millennium also saw Priya sharpen its focus on gender through work on gender mainstreaming in institutions and preventing sexual harassment at workplace. Priya began by first auditing its own structures and organization systems before sharing its learning and building capacities of others. In the past decade, we have deliberately focused on understanding the complexities of participation in a socially fragmented society and promoting the right to participation for all sections, especially for young people and adolescents. From seeking participation in democratic governance of society, our efforts have moved towards democracy in everyday life. What have been the result of our work as knowledge institution, emphasizing learning and use of knowledge as a vehicle for change? Going beyond the numbers you see right now on the screen, the impact of our work is found in removing obstacles, valuing knowledge, amplifying voices, and making democracy work for all. Now, coming back to the theme on which we're having this conversation, sustainable urban future. Priya as an organization recognized the emerging urban challenges as early in 1980s through understanding the realities of pavement dwellers and informal construction workers residing and working in Indian cities who were deprived of basic social security benefits. After the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act enacted in 1993 was a watershed moment for decentralized governance in India. And after that, we tried addressing capacity deficits in elected councillors through innovative training and learning methodologies. We organized its first ever pan-state network of women councillors. We also conducted research and evidence-based advocacy for greater and faster devolution of functions, funds, and functionaries. We have been able to establish more than 50 urban resource centers to support both supply and demand sides of urban governance, citizens, elected councillors, and municipal officials. We also facilitated the first ever participatory town plans in India and participatory city development plans. We've strengthened citizen participation in citywide sanitation planning through SICs, under our program, Engage Citizen Responsive City Initiative. We've also been able to develop gender assessment and integration framework for making urban sanitation programs gender inclusive. Costa, sir, over to you. You're on mute.
Thank you so much, Nikita, for capturing an incredible journey of Priya as an institution. Not only in the areas of sustainable urban future, but also in many thematic areas. So today's conversation has some context in which we want to have this discussion. If you look at the recent national flagship programs of the national government and also the state government, many of these programs have been using the phrase putting citizen at the center. But if you look at the reality, barring one or two incidences, mostly it has remained a rhetoric. And citizen engagement in cities' policy development and decision making has largely remained absent. On the other hand, a few civil society organizations has experimented citizen engagement. However, many such engagements are sporadic and often unsustainable. because when the civil society organizations have intervened in a particular city, you see a kind of barrage of activities, some kind of churning within the citizenry, whether it is with the middle class citizen or with the apartment dwellers or with the informal communities. But when civil society organizations withdraw from such experimentations, many a times we see another phase of lull in citizen engagement. So there is sort of lack of continuity in terms of engaging on a regular basis with the city administration and municipal governance. And therefore, this participation deficit has adversely impacted the transparency and accountability of the elected councillors, also the municipal officials. And what we have been observing over the last 22 years, that the provisioning of ward committees under the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act or the citizen participation law, which was stopped under the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, have not been implemented in its letter and spirit in most cities and most states. We have come to a situation where many civil society organizations or even non-profit groups have tried, to use technology which can play an important role in advancing citizen engagement. However, we cannot deny the existing digital divide, and many a times the informal community in the city do not have access to those technologies or those digital devices which would enable their participation, their voices in the city decision-making process. But 21st century city governance, of course, needs an active citizenry to improve inclusivity, effectiveness, transparency, and accountability. So with this background, we are asking two simple yet profound questions in this discussion. First, what innovations have been fostered to promote citizen engagement in urban governance, and how these innovations can be institutionalized and scaled up? So we are looking for examples, primarily from India, but also from other continents, other countries, so that we can sort of educate ourselves to strategize our future intervention in such a way so that there is greater engagement of citizens. The second is that what forms of collaborative learning will help achieve increased capacities of civil society to scale up citizen engagement. The emphasis here is collaborative learning within civil society groups, but also between civil society groups and city officials, other stakeholders who have a stake in cities' governance, decision making, and planning. So, with these context and these two questions, we have a wonderful panel today. And we have requested Dr. Jaydev Gupta, who is the fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, and Preeta Venkatachalam, who is a partner and head of Market Impact South Asia at the Bridgespan India, to set the stage for all of us. And then we'll go for deep dive conversation. And we have several speakers, among which Mr. Srinivas Alavelli, who is heading the Civic Participation Program in Janagraha Center for Citizenship and Democracy. They are based in Bangalore. Then Roshni Nagehali, who is the Executive Director at Yuva. Yuva has been active in several Indian cities and promoting citizen participation, particularly looking at the participation of the informal communities or the residents who are living in informal settlements. We have Jeff Thindoa, who is the program manager for Global Partnership for Social Accountability, Gpsa, at the World Bank. And we have been working with Jeff on various issues around social accountability. We have Akhila Sivadas, Managing Trustee and Executive Director, Center for Advocacy and Research. And Akhila has and Sifar has been involved and active in many Indian cities, again, helping citizens to access services, their entitlements, and so on and so forth. And we have Rushta Majid, who is heading the India Country Program at Bernard Van Leer Foundation of the Netherlands. And Rushta has done tremendous experimentation and scaling up work vis-a-vis children's participation in city planning. So we have a lovely panel with us. And of course, we have several participants with us. Many of you have been practicing citizen engagement in your own work. You have been supporting that work for others. So it will be lovely to hear your voice as well and your experience as well. So we have a dedicated question, answer, and open discussion time, but you can participate, share your comments, you can ask your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll see on the bottom of your screen at any time of the presentation. And I would request all our panelists to respond to those questions and comments. So while we talk, we can also respond to some of the questions and comments. And towards the end, I will request Dr. Rajesh Tandon, who is the founder president of PRIA, to summarize the discussion and highlight what are the key takeaways from today's discussion. So that's all to begin our discussion. I can see Srinivas has joined. I'm not sure whether Jaydev has already joined. I can't see Jaydev, so maybe what I'll do, I will ask Preeta to start her presentation. But before that, let's have some fun. And I have a couple of questions for you. And the first question is like this. I don't know whether panelists can see those questions and participate in that, but definitely all the participants can vote or participate in this poll. So the question is that, have you ever visited the municipal office in your city where you live now? Okay, that's excellent. So let me tell you the result. There were sort of 4 options to it. One was never needed to visit. Okay, I just need to announce one thing that, although our discussion will be predominantly in English, but there is Hindi interpretation available. And those who want to hear what the speakers are saying in English, but you want to hear it in Hindi, you can do so. And you can do so by, clicking an icon which looks like a globe, and it's written here, interpretation. So if you want to hear it in Hindi, then you just select Hindi, and our colleagues are interpreting that. You can hear in your own language. So let me tell you the results. So never needed to visit what was one option, and then yes for paying property tax and bills, yes for making a complaint, and yes for providing suggestions. So the first answer, never needed to visit, 33% of people are saying that there was no need to visit. And then 57% is saying that paying for property tax and bills, 26% are saying to make a complaint, and 17% are saying for providing suggestions. Lucky those 17% to provide some suggestions. So let me end this poll here and ask the second question. Well, it has nothing to do to verify your civic score, but just for fun. The second question is that, have you ever participated in any consultation in your city for improving municipal services? And the answers are yes, organized by CSOs or a third party or organization. Yes, organized by municipal corporation or council. And the third option is never. Okay, so yes, organized by CSOs, third party, almost half, 48% people are saying that they have participated. Yes, organized by municipal corporation or council, 20%, and never, 45%. These are not mutually exclusive. I mean, so just to get your opinion on this third question, do you think digital technology can make citizen engagement in city governance more inclusive? First option is yes, it will enhance ease of engagement. Yes, with some help, even digitally challenged people can engage. No, only a few elite citizens will be able to engage. And no, the poor and marginalized will never be able to engage. Okay, so let us end the poll and share the result. Can you see the results? The first option, 28% people are saying yes, it will enhance ease of engagement. 44% are saying that yes, with some help. Others, those who are digitally challenged, can also participate. And 21% are saying only the few elite citizens will be able to engage. And 38% think that no, the poor and marginalized will never be able to engage. Interesting insights from all the participants. And let me stop sharing. And with this, let me also invite Preeta. Lots of food for thought, Preeta. I hope so after seeing these poll results. Welcome, Jaydev. Preeta, would you go with your slides?
Yeah, happy to go first. So thanks to Priya for co-hosting this session, which is really important, more so in the times of the pandemic when the importance of urban well-being as well as inclusive urban governance could not have been emphasized more. I think traditionally in India, a lot of the development focus has been naturally more in rural health, rural livelihoods, rural education. But I think the pandemic has laid bare the need for more inclusive systems overall for urban governance and overall urban development. I'm going to look at a very unique or a particular angle of what we're calling inclusive urban governance today. And that's just to spur discussion on multiple innovations. I think through the poll, we talked about digital being one enhancer of reaching marginalized and poor communities in urban settings. But I'm going to focus deeply on community engagement, which we at Britspan did a deep study on last year during the first wave of the pandemic, and realized the number of issues and challenges that needed to be overcome to even reach some of these urban slum or informal settlement population with very essential and basic services. And I'm sure my other co-panelists and speakers will touch upon the other range of urban governance requirements. So I will caveat that I'm going to focus deeply on community engagement as part of citizen engagement, focused on urban slum context. What I will do over the next few minutes, I hope my screen is visible. So I'm going to talk about some of the learnings we had from looking at the community engagement models that were deployed in slums of Mumbai in particular, but also across other slums, not only in India, but across global South countries to tackle COVID-19. So we started the study at the peak of the first wave, during the lockdown in India. And we started with saying, why is community engagement even important as part of engaging with citizens in the development agenda in face of crisis, i.e. the pandemic? We then moved on to say, what were the different activities or roles that slum communities have engaged in light of the pandemic? And drawing on that, we tried to map some of the community engagement models and capture learnings that we believe can be applicable not just in crisis context, but also more generally when we come back to hopefully a new normal, as well as not only in health, but across the development sector overall. And in undertaking this study, we engaged deeply with policymakers, public health officials, philanthropists, a lot of government officials in the local municipal government. So yes, Kaustav, despite the pandemic, we did have to actually at that time visit municipal offices to interview a lot of the frontline municipal workers as well as the municipal administrators to understand how they are tackling the pandemic. And then most importantly, a lot of the civil society organization. I know Roshni is with us today and will share more ground up perspectives on how Yuva tackled this. But we spoke to a range of NGOs like Sneha, TIS, Spark, Project Mumbai, Yuva, of course, etc., that really were working closely with communities to deploy innovative responses to the pandemic. So the first thing we started with was understanding what are the needs of the slum communities. And we saw that they were really multidimensional and given the pandemic, quite dire and urgent. So as you can see on this slide, we saw a range of needs, as I mentioned, and of course, health was, paramount given the pandemic, and not only the COVID-related health needs, but also some of the more routine and critical healthcare needs that were getting sidelined in the face of the pandemic. And then there were a range of other livelihoods and socioeconomic needs that slum populations were facing that range from migrant population needs to livelihoods, childcare, lack of education because many didn't have access to digital or even basic internet connectivity, etc. So with this as our beginning, we went into understanding how partners that are engaging with communities have really helped with inclusive urban governance. And the first thing was how the solutions are much more tailored when you embed in community engagement and understanding community needs. To give one example, we all know much about Dharavi, which is talked about not just in Indian media, but also global media. But if you look at other slums of Mumbai, like for example, the M East ward, it's a very stark contrast to Dharavi, both in terms of whether it's a vertical or horizontally spread informal settlement. Are there sources of livelihoods within the slum, or are they actually very dependent on going to households and hence more vulnerable to the stringent lockdown India imposed? What are their sources of resilience in terms of getting just basic food, water, shelter in the face of the pandemic? So what we realized is that even within a city, 30 to 40% of the population experienced very different contexts to build inclusive urban solutions. The second thing, as you saw in the previous slide, was just the diversity of needs. So to really build an urban governance model that listened to the citizens holistically, one needed to engage them across the spectrum of needs, not just what was important at a point of time. The third area we worked on deeply was just how models build trust amongst communities. And I'll talk about this more in the subsequent slides, but there were many innovations such as engaging religious or faith leaders in the urban slums, sometimes even engaging rickshaw drivers who had the trust and knowledge of urban local context, and sometimes even the language needs that were required to relate to the communities there. And finally, what was needed to sustain and scale impact. We interviewed the BMC officials, and they were the first to say that some of their initial work in tracking, tracing, and testing COVID completely failed because people were in fear to even come forward to the government to be tested for COVID. So only when they started enlisting community support, and Africa saw this similarly in Ebola, when along with UNICEF, they set up community care centers, and not a single person in Sierra Leone and other Ebola affected countries walked in. But the moment they co-opted communities, there was a lot more community trust as well as reliance on the engagement of government and other multilateral, bilateral partners. In terms of the COVID preparedness, we saw three big areas that the slum communities engaged themselves in. The first one was improving awareness and more healthy behaviors. And of course, all of us in the more wealthy context are well aware of masking, social distancing, water, better hygiene practices. But in the slum context, given some of these facilities were not even available, getting communities on board to spread social awareness, Sometimes there were loudspeakers in the religious areas that actually broadcasted some of these messages. Also behaviors to enable people to come to the nearest primary health center to get tested for COVID, isolate if they were testing positive, etc., really required co-opting community leaders and the local community influencers. The second area was in terms of service support, and all of us from the outside think that services are delivered to the communities, but we actually saw a very high degree of participation, co-creation, and execution of services by community leaders, youth collectives, community action groups in multiple slums that we studied. And finally, in terms of informing both policy action as well as new policies that came into play in face of COVID. And these related to enabling better wash conditions in slums as well as access to health systems. So a lot of the community volunteer groups took it upon themselves to either use social media or even write letters to the municipal authorities and the municipal government representatives in the slum to inform their action during COVID. So these were three big areas where communities were deeply engaged themselves, some on their own right and some with support of government, NGO, and philanthropic partners. That led us to understanding what are the roles that communities can play. And we have actually surprisingly found deep engagement on these three models, not just in India, but also across the global South. So we were invited by the World Health Organization as well as the World Communities Forum to present on this to Global South informal settlement players to look at what are the three models, how communities can participate more deeply. The first one is the recipient model, but as it's shaded in gray, we realize that this is not the ideal model to work with communities, but sometimes in face of crisis, they are thrown out of their normal balance and their regular sources of basic services and livelihoods. And what actually happened in the Mumbai slums context last year and during the second wave is that a lot of the essential products and services required support from NGO partners, BMC, and other players that had to provide, for example, food kits, rations, and other health services to the communities. And as the lockdown lifted, there were also other services like psychosocial supports, cash transfers for livelihoods, and sometimes job boards to refer them to informal other jobs that they could actually depend on for their livelihoods. The second big area was being a partner. So here, community members were very closely involved in co-creating not just the solution, but also helping in executing the solution. And there are several examples, but the one that comes to mind is what Sneha did in some of the slums like in Dharavi, Govandi, and Malwani, where they worked with community action groups to provide a range of services like rations, healthcare, telemedicine, and psychosocial supports. And the community leaders there in the community action groups worked hand in hand with the Sneha community volunteers, not just for decision making, but also in engaging in these activities and to reach it to every, kind of hutment in the community there. So there was true partnership at all levels between the civil society workers there, as well as the community members. And the third model, which I'm sure Roshni will speak to, so I'll just introduce the model, is that of an owner. And this is very difficult to implement just at times of crisis, but a lot of civil society and other partners who have been deeply embedded and working with communities over not just a few years, but sometimes several decades, have actually trained and nurtured communities' trust and social capital to treat them as actual owners of solving their problems. And Yuva, which Roshni leads, had multiple innovative models for more inclusive action at time of COVID. And some of their work in Ambujwadi in terms of youth collectives, where their youth collectives themselves manufactured masks or set up community health kitchens to provide food to the communities, are some examples where the communities were primary decision makers and also primary resource providers for their neighbors at times of crisis. And I think the owner model, obviously, as the graph shows, has the highest level of community participation engagement, but it does require a lot more investment in capacity building, nurturing of trust, and building cohesiveness and the peer-to-peer connects in the community. So some of these examples, as I mentioned, were tried by many NGOs as well as government. And there have been many innovations here on inclusive governance and inclusive participation. And I spoke about a lot of this, so I will not dwell upon it more. But I think the only thing I would like to highlight is that you will see the focus shift from the left-hand side on the recipient model, where NGOs like Swast or Project Mumbai or Sneha led the initiative to provide services, to the owner model, where you'll see community members themselves leading the response and some kind of external support provided where they need help and have asked for help. So the agency and collective ownership very much shifts from the recipient model to the owner model in a more desirable way to the communities. So finally, I'd just like to leave us with some thoughts about how do external stakeholders, whether it's government or NGO partners, engage and collaborate with communities. And I think the main thing we learned is that to really understand deeply the socio-economic, political, legal characteristics of a slum before jumping in, because really there's no one size fit all. So even as you look at how do you deploy a partner model or a owner model, you know, what you do in say a Kenya versus say a Malawi slum versus an India slum could be very different. And then within a city, within Mumbai, again, it's not homogeneous. So we learned that the characteristics really define the context in which players have to operate. The second thing is that we saw the fluidity and flexibility that was required in face of crisis, such as the COVID pandemic. And community roles often shifted. So at the peak of the lockdown, they were very much recipients of, say, the food kits or water supply. But as the lockdown lifted, many of the communities marshaled resources to set up community kitchens or themselves undertake awareness campaigns about COVID, social awareness about masking, taking their neighbors for testing, etc. So there was no one model, even for that entire 6-month period. It shifted, and partners that work with slum communities therefore need to be agile and nimble to adapt to the community needs. The last point I would make here is that we interviewed several community members and community action group leaders, and the youth collectives that we spoke to as well were very clear that, you know, dignity and self-reliance was their #1 goal. So many of them were quite flustered that in face of the lockdown, they were moved from being self-reliant to being reliant on providers of resources and basic services. But they were very much keen to script how their agenda should be evolved through the face of crisis and after, to actually build greater inclusiveness in the way they contribute to their governance. So that's a message that I'd really like to leave with all of us as we think about inclusivity and collaborating with communities. So I'll pause here and hand back to Kaustav, and happy to take questions in the round during the discussion.
Thank you so much, Preeta. Very insightful. We'll come back to these questions that, you know, a lot of your experience has been described here in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the lessons that you have drawn and the transition that you have sort of, in a way, theorized from recipient to partner to ownership is in the context of COVID. But I believe that it has a generic value as well. You know, how far this could also be applied on a day-to-day basis, even when the community is not in crisis. And of course, the recipient part, although it's sort of you shared it a bit differently, but, you know, accessing services from the municipalities or the local governance institutions, other institutions, which are to support their day-to-day life is crucial. And therefore, you know, the partnership and ownership becomes the basis for claiming those services, claiming their rights, claiming their entitlements from many of those institutions. So it could also be seen other way around. So we can come back to this question later. Let me now invite Dr. Jaydev Gupta. In your absence, I was introducing you, Jaydev. Jaydev is a fellow at the Institute for Development Studies based in Sussex, UK. Jaydev, please.
Sure. Thank you, Kastu. I hope you can hear and see me, and apologies to all for joining you a few minutes late. It's one of those days where one Zoom seminar leads to another. But I've been really looking forward to this, and I can see Rajesh Bhai there on the screen as well. Hi, Rajesh. So after many years, it would have been nice to have been there in person, but of course we are stuck in this reality. Let me also try and share my screen if I can. And so just quite briefly in the few minutes that Kaustubh, you've afforded me at the start of this, I did want to set the scene on some broad principles. And Preetha, your presentation just now, I was listening to it with a great deal of interest. I will really reaffirmed many of the points that I wish to make. From studies across that we're involved in India and across Africa, Latin America at the moment. So there's a lot of mutually arrived conclusions or anchoring points. So it's really good to see in this debate. I will focus a little bit on this issue of smartness, this issue of ICT-based solutions to enhancing citizen engagement that we seem to be over-reliant on. And I will, Kaustubh, focus also on the post-pandemic environment, because indeed it is, it's this reality that we're going to have to face with. That said, let me begin my remarks by firstly acknowledging, but then also making a critical point around the violence of the pandemic, right? I mean, I really believe that any conversation around scaling up citizen participation in the future needs to acknowledge the experience of subaltern groups through the pandemic, many of which was extremely violent and detrimental to long-standing struggles for rights in the city. Right. And when I say violence of the pandemic, I don't mean to exceptionalize it, even if we did see certain types of violences, certain types of behavior from local authorities, including evictions and criminalization of informality, rise during the pandemic. This was akin to long-standing struggles that subaltern groups, marginalized groups, low-resource groups have been facing for long histories predating the pandemic. And so moving forward, if we are talking about scaling up participation, I think we do need to explicitly put on the table a do no harm principle of urban practice. And that really means we set aside the brutal policing regimes we've relied on in India and beyond, right? So this isn't pointing fingers. This is recognizing that in times of emergency, we have had to be more brutal in the way we control our public space, and we must not normalize that, must not see that as part of urban practice as we look to upscale civic engagement. And the risk here really is that we end up normalizing what is really meant to be a momentary view in the way we conduct urban business. And so we need to recognize these as complex and empowered struggles for rights in the city that took a momentary aberration for us to get through and past this pandemic. And any new normal, any upscaling efforts need to create space to address the violence that's been sustained, but also think about reconciliation and resolution as part of that effort to upscale civic engagement, right? So I thought it's a really important starting point to make. Having said that, moving to looking explicitly at upscaling engagement in the digital city, and I hope my slides are still working. This is to recognize that we are in a state where we have a tremendous infrastructural shortfall already. Upwards of 40% of infrastructure that we require isn't even built yet, and the infrastructure in brick and mortar that we have today is deeply gendered. Women, men, children access infrastructure in very unequal ways. And we've replicated this in our digital infrastructures. Women are much less likely to be online, much less likely to use devices like smartphones, and these inequalities are magnified when it comes to looking at low-income groups in many ways. And these are, of course, much more complex than I'm presenting at this moment, but we need to recognize that. Because as we talk about upscaling civic engagement, and here I'm drawing on work that my colleagues at IDS have been doing, looking at digital openings and closings in Africa through the African Digital Rights Network. And I really encourage all of our colleagues gathered today to visit the website and access the wonderful resources that are made available there. The key here is to take note of all of the digital closings that have happened. And I say this again, mindful of the pandemic, how we've had to increase digital surveillance. We've had to rely on ICT-based, CCTV-based surveillance of the city. We've had to really clamp down on digital spaces for very required reasons, to control public space, to control mass misinformation. These have been required steps that we've had to take, but we do need to classify them as digital closings. And why is that? It's because we are increasingly reliant on digital spaces for our civic engagement, for our advocacy needs. And I say this as a double-edged knife, if you will, but also it's not only a challenge, it's also an opportunity, because we've seen right through the pandemic as well that online advocacy didn't all stop. Indeed, we saw tremendous efforts at grouping and regrouping subaltern marginalized groups online. We also saw that in-person, physical, on-ground advocacy continued right through the pandemic. And this was really seen in the role of our community leaders in slum settlements. Preeta mentioned an excellent set of activities, and we will hear more. But across African settlements, across Latin American settlements, we did see traditional so-called community leaders continuing their efforts. And so there were many openings alongside these closings. And we need to recognize this balance and tension as we look to upscale engagement and indeed increase opportunities for advocating for citizens' rights, rather than rushing into ICT-based solutions as some sort of a utopian, techno-utopian solution to all problems around scaling up in the future. And of course, this is a quote I've often used, Habermas's quote around smartness being driven by democratic means rather than simply technocratic means. That's really the heart of my point around how ICT-based digital solutions can be operationalized to scale up. And then just last point here, and this is a bit of a step away from the rich detail of what we've seen in programmatic sense to more broader principles around governing urban futures. And I think post-pandemic urban futures can just be called urban futures, because the pandemic is absolutely a part of what it means to live in and around the city now, no matter how you look at it. And that means we need to balance quite carefully between our desire to provide agency to very locally rooted relative understandings of everyday experiences with universal knowledge around healthy living in cities now, which includes how we understand and manage and govern density, for example, all of the science around the pandemic, of course. And here we know that it's and the reason this is important to our conversation today is because we know advocacy and communication is such an important part of the governance agenda now, because it's not just about knowing the right science, right? It's not just about evidence-based policymaking. It's about convincing people that we are using the right science, because people have we are in this charged atmosphere where people's opinions are driven by multiple views. Even if science fact shows one view, people can be convinced of something quite different. And that means operating at multiple scales at once, right? Local, but also across many locals. And Preeta, you mentioned this. There's differences within cities, across cities, but importantly, those differences are also across what Colin McFarlane is calling urban fragments, right? These broken pieces of everyday urban life produce very different sociopolitical realities. And if we are looking to advocate even very locally rooted movements, advocate for them, we need to somehow be able to balance universal truths in and amongst that. And I feel the way that this is going to happen is to invest in multidisciplinary anchoring points. And I know this is not anything new. Colleagues in Priya, you all have been investing in capacity strengthening for a very long time, and I indeed have learned so much from you. But we need to absolutely invest in understanding each other ideologically, politically, and make these civic bridges across disciplines. That is a set of activities that won't be wasted. That does involve, some are seeing that as an additional cost, but I think we just need to see that as the way to upscale, as the way to bring a new form of civic engagement to our urban futures. I'll stop there, Kaustuv, and back to you. And I'm looking forward to hearing from my co-panelists and the discussion.
Thank you, Jaydev. And both of you, Preeta and Jaydev, have laid down several points which would like to take further in our deep dive conversation. I would continue to encourage all our participants to make comments. Informal chit chat is fine, but you can also engage in the dialogue and ask any question or comments, what you have heard or what you are going to hear from other discussions. So thank you, Jaydev, and thank you, Preeta, once again. Nikita, if I come back to you, Nikita, is this the right time to launch another poll?
Yes,
Just
we can do this quickly. Yeah.
So you have to tell all of us that what we should do.
All right. So I'm going to share my screen with all of you, and just give me a second. Here is my screen. Kostas, are you able to see the screen?
Yes, we can see that.
Yes. So I will request all the participants to go to www.menti.com. And there's a code on your screen towards the top. You need to type in that code and send in your responses. So you can send in up to 3 responses. And then the question is, what has worked in enhancing citizen engagement in city planning and governance? So this is the question. And whatever thoughts you have, we would request you to go to www.menti.com and type in that code. Kaustav sir, can you please send in the code in the chat?
So the website URL and the code both are shared on chat box. So you can click www.menti.com and enter this code. Then you will see the screen.
Yes, we've started getting responses.
Okay, so the question was, what has worked in enhancing citizen engagement in city planning and governance? Sustainable planning, devolution, constitution, participatory approaches, technology, awareness. awareness, penetration of technology, inclusive processes.
Nine participants have sent in their responses, so it will be great if all of you can participate.
Yes. E-governance, mobilization,
We'll wait for like a minute more for all of you to quickly go to www.menti.com, type in the code and send us your thoughts and ideas.
ward committees, great. Youth voices, right. Localization. Leadership of young women.
You can also send in your responses in Hindi language, and you might see the question in the chat box in Hindi as well.
Policy. Excellent. I would request our panelists to take note of these various insights which are coming from our participants. And that's the question we are going to discuss now. So let us go to the next segment of our program by inviting our 5 discussions. We have Mr. Srinivas Alavedli from Janagra, Rashni Nagehli from Yuba, Jaydev Gupta from Gpsa World Bank, Akhila Shivdas from SIFAR, and Rushda Majid from Bernard Van Leer Foundation. So let me start with Srinivas. Srinivas, you have been sort of deeply engaged in promoting citizen participation in Bangalore and many other cities, and you saw some of the insights from the participants. So what are your thoughts that what has worked in terms of promoting citizen participation? And if I put an adjective before that, inclusive citizen participation.
Sure. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, we can hear you, Srinivas.
Okay, thank you so much for making me part of this. It's wonderful to be in the company of so many amazing individuals and organizations that have been working in this very important area of governance, and particularly with citizen participation. Unlike other forms of other tiers of governance, citizen participation makes the most impact and most sense for a local government, as we all already know. And the pandemic has really made it extremely abundantly clear that the government just does not have the capacity to do things without active citizen partnership. Decentralization has been a demand that became old and tired for many, many years. We keep referring to 74th Amendment, even though it has been more than 25, 27 years, and we still have to keep referring to that. And the community participation laws and the ward committees and all of these things remain on paper for the large part in most of India. But the pandemic changed all of that. In my humble opinion, the pandemic has made the city officials, the mayors, the commissioners realize the futility of the work that they can accomplish with the scale at which the pandemic has hit us. So that's where the ward committees or citizen participation has taken a new lease of life in India. And we have seen it firsthand in Bengaluru and many other cities. When the Mumbai commissioner keeps saying, I have abandoned the central call center and created 28 ward level call centers or war rooms, he is endorsing the decentralization loudly and clearly. And that message is pretty much same, whether you go to Cuttack in Odisha or Guwahati in Assam or Bengaluru in Karnataka. In Karnataka, we already have ward committees in Bengaluru. I'm fortunate to be working on that for quite some time now. And during the COVID pandemic, the ward committees have become the ward DITR committees, and DITR stands for Decentralized Triaging and Emergency Response. The name itself conveys that the triaging and emergency response are better handled at a ward level, which is a smaller unit of governance with lesser population than, say, at a city level or even at the zonal level. And elaborate plans were made, triage centers were built, people got involved, citizens played a role in every little aspect of COVID pandemic handling within their ward, right from isolation, helping families that are sick, helping people that cannot be isolated in the home with the common isolation centers. Any which way, the decentralized governance has really come to the fore during the pandemic. And I'm happy to say that along with that, Janagraha continue to work on the very interesting and an effective way of creating this long-term citizen engagement. The reason why things like ward committees do not function very well is that it requires a certain amount of sustained energy from at least a few people. And these things they start with a bang and then they don't contain or sustain. Because in the middle, there is elections, there is corporators that come, that go, officers' attitude towards the decentralized governance makes a big difference. Certain officers are big fans and proponents of that. Some others don't care much about that. And that completely changes the way in which these things progress. So how do you create sustainable forums? Without ward committees, we strongly believe that it's nearly impossible to create a formal citizen participation in urban governance, because all other forms have been tried and failed. I myself was an activist for many years before I came on board on Janagraha, and have led large citizen movements opposing flyovers and demanding public transport and so on. And I noticed that the delta or the gaps in that approach at where it can no longer scale or no longer work. You can always create an energy on a particular point issue, but you cannot solve governance on a long-term basis without a formal engagement with the local government. And that's where ward committees work. And the unique approach that Janagraha has been trying, and in case many of you may not be aware, is connecting the city budgets to the ward committees and the participation. City budgets, unlike the union budget and the state government, are very, very unknown or lesser known in India. Nobody knows what is the annual budget of Bengaluru or Mysuru or Ahmedabad and Allahabad. People know a little bit about BMC because it's a very rich corporation, so we know how big it is and how many thousands of crores is the budget. But even then, people don't know what happens to that budget. And the energy and the focus when a budget is made for the country, the media is looking at it with a sharp eye, including what halwa is made the night before the budget is presented and what color sari the minister is wearing while presenting the budget. Same thing happens at the state level. But the monumental event of presenting the city budget goes without any noise in the media or in the public domain. Nobody even knows when the budget is made, who has made it, what does the budget say about my quality of life. Whereas this particular budget itself makes a lot of difference to whether you're going to be bit by mosquitoes and you'll get dengue, or are you able to walk freely on your footpath. Yet there is no importance given to the making of the budget or the enforcement of the budget, the decisions made in the budget. So Janagraha has taken this approach with a unique campaign called My City, My Budget. In the process of making budget itself, we take input from all cross sections of the city. For example, in the last year's edition of My City, My Budget, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, we went to every corner, every ward of the city and every section of the society, including slums and street vendors and so on and so forth, and collected nearly 10,000 inputs. 10,000 citizens rather participated in that. And we focused on a couple of issues like public toilets and footpaths. And we asked people to give inputs on that. Then we work with the local city government and say, here are the input that came in. Let's do a cost estimate of that. And this is a joint program with the BBMP, the Municipal Corporation. So they have accepted this. The long story short, in the interest of time, I'm fast forwarding it. As of a few months ago, I'm very happy to tell you that the Municipal Corporation, the city government of Bengaluru, has allocated 60 lakhs of rupees to each of the ward committees to work on the footpaths and potholes and the local issues. What that means is that the ward committee at their disposal now have real money that they can use for local solutions. This is a dream come true, because most of the time we keep making demands and somebody will say, yeah, we'll do it, or next year's budget and all that. Now they are saying, you solve your local problems locally. Here is the money for it. You decide. Is this what's the best way of spending this money? You guys can decide within your ward committee. And that has happened. And that doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory and perfect and everyone is doing these things. But we now have a very solid footing on which people can participate in the ward committee. And a lot of people ask, why should I go to ward committee? They don't solve any problems. When I go there, I complain something, nothing happens. There is no planning there. It just turns out to be another grievance redressal meeting. All of those issues are now addressed by bringing in the factor of money and budget into that. So that gives people an incentive to now monitor what happens to the money and plan and resolve conflicts. One part of the ward wants a park to be beautified. Another part of the ward wants a footpath to be there so that senior citizens can walk or anyone can walk. When both these citizens are sitting in the same meeting, it becomes very clear that the priority should be on the footpath. Maybe the beautification can happen next year. So that sort of conflict resolution or consensus building can happen in a ward committee. And we are very hopeful, and we are taking this participatory budgeting model to many other cities across India and throughout the state of Odisha in the coming days, including even more parameters like measuring the baseline of the walkability, of the garbage, of various things. So therefore, it becomes a factor on top of which you want to improve, utilize the budget based on things that are not working well for you. So this is called Ward Infrastructure Index. We create an index, then we take input from citizens, then we combine these things to come up with a realistic budget that citizens can use. So I'm not sure how much time I have, but I will pause here and I can continue on this later if there are questions.
We'll come back, Srinivas. Thank you so much for underlining the importance of having a civic infrastructure such as ward committees and linking the budget with the participation process, which means then citizens have a space to participate in the decision making that what might be required in that particular, and in the insights that we have just received from the participant, somebody was talking about localization. So that's a perfect example of localization. Let me now invite Rashni. Rashni?
Yeah, thanks, Kaustubh. Thanks, Priya, Janagra, and Bridgespan for having us here. And I'm very inspired by Srinivas's talk about the ward committees. I'm originally from Bangalore and I've been part of several of those campaigns. So it's good that now things are moving. So thanks for that.
Priya ka or sabka.
Yeah. I think I just want to quickly open with the principle that, all of us are guided by here. I think, the principle of, participation, the right of people, especially participation in governance. So I think it's important that we once again center that as a constitutional guarantee as part of the, 74th Amendment, but also as part of the Nagar Raj.
Rashni, let me
Sure.
Yashvi, you have to mute or you have to be on your channel. Go ahead, Rashmi, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so just centering the constitutional right and the guarantee of participation, I think that's very important. And it's what all of us are working towards, and also I think rooted in the justice framework, right, which makes it clear that actually participation is most important for those who are already marginalized and who are vulnerable. And I think that special efforts needs to be put into enabling their participation and, not just participation in voice, but also transparency and the ability to push for accountability. I think these are some of the principles underpinning all of our work here today, and definitely also Yuva's work specifically. And I just thought, lest we forget that the larger space is one of the human justice and, rights framework. I think we should center that. Having said that, there are several complexities in the urban governance space, right? We all know that we have not just the ULBs, but also the executive wings. And then we have several parastatals, development authorities, which complicate the matter. the shift from the panchayats to towns and MCs further complexifies. Overall, I also see a huge lack of political will in decentralization, particularly handing over power from the state to the local levels. And while we do look at the representative democratic space in the ULBs, I think the spaces for people's direct agency, like the ward committees, area sabhas, mohalla sabhas, both are weak. ULB elections get delayed. There are special town statuses. There are SPVs. I think all of these complexities primarily lead back to the lack of political will, which is why this is ultimately also a political question, I think. And in cities, there are several groups which are invisible, right? Missing from official records, documents. We've seen which of those groups, during the pandemic that's really come out. I think another important point that we miss while talking about, participation is how cities are built and how they grow. Cities originally actually have been grown by people's own planning, people's own decisions, particularly that of the poor, their locations for their homes, their markets, and this exists before formal planning and formal budgeting comes into the picture. But these are also ignored by these formal needs. And because of this, it creates a dissonance between what people want to participate and say, as well as how city governance is shaped. So I think a little bit about the realities under which we are working would also be very important in the cities and towns as we move ahead, in the next few years of this country's progress. I think what I thought we could spend some time on today is to, while we do want to push for the larger policy level changes to ensure that the 74th is implemented in its entirety, spirit and letter, I think I want to take on Preeta's invitation to speak a little bit of the examples from the ground that I think indicate how we've been able to claim different pieces of the larger participation in the urban governance puzzle, so to speak. I think first I want to mention an example of the strength and scope of the concept of a Mohalla Sabha, which is similar, modeled on the similar means of a Gram Sabha. In Nagpur, the Patta rights, which is a legal tenure rights, were granted through a government resolution after several years of advocacy and collaboration between a local network called Shahar Vikas Manch and Yuva, almost decades of work. So it was a huge achievement to have such a government resolution passed where slum dwellers, where Basti people living in Bastis will actually have tenure security. However, it's easy to have that in place, but implementation was a huge challenge. So I think Mohalla Sabhas was a big strategy that was used by Shahar Vikas Manch and Yuva to really, one, identify the beneficiaries, and facilitate documentation, work with the municipal corporation to do the plan table surveys, and primarily push for accountability. If that hadn't happened, I think maybe this would have just been something which was on paper and not really implemented. And I think this example is interesting because it's the example of a Mohalla Sabha, not just for basic services, which is what we normally see Mohalla Sabhas and ward Sabhas be useful for, but also pushing for land rights, which is such a political issue. And I think without this space of actually creating everybody sitting around the table and then deciding that, yes, these are the people who are allocated, who are the rightful owners, it would have been very, very difficult to implement. Of course, this is not complete. The struggle is still on. But whatever has happened, I do think it's quite a big achievement without big money or big optics. It's really been an entire people's-led process. So I think really going back to the strength of actually the direct representation of people in their decision-making, it's an important example. Another one I want to talk about is the participation of people in land use planning, primarily through master plan processes. And I want to speak about the example of Mumbai, the Mumbai Development Plan 2034. We know that local area plans exist only on paper primarily, but through people's leadership, we have been able to see in some places where this has been realized. The Hamara Shahar Abhiyan in Mumbai ran from 2009 to 2014-15 towards the Mumbai Development Plan. A lot of engagement, very strong campaign, really working, opening up beyond suggestions and objections, really opening up ward level consultations, which was, I think, unheard of. Not only ward-wise consultation, but also thematic consultations where I could directly go sit and talk to people and make sure that that was registered. So it's not just something I submit to an office. And also actually very concrete changes happened in the land use. For instance, the Koli, which is a fishing community, the original inhabitants of Mumbai, they've really been able to negotiate for reservation of their lands for homes and livelihoods. Huge, huge impact. Homeless shelters, which thus far were just, money was allocated, but there was no land use reservations. Through the Mumbai Shahar campaign and PIs which are filed, actually homeless reservations, shelter reservations became a reality, and several other social amenities were able to be reserved. Now again, planning, which is a huge part of the urban governance space, I think people getting involved in that, is a very, very important space for us to push, particularly for those who are most marginalized. Related to that, a Mohalla Malwani in Bombay, informal Mohalla primarily, in partnership with local collectives and architects, we really were able to create a Malwani People's Plan, which was once again presented at the ward level and through different consultations. Now, it's not that the entire plan was obviously realized in the final Mumbai DP, but I think it gave people a vision, a very concrete vision, and it enables them to now participate in an ongoing way as the Mumbai DP is being implemented by the corporation. So I think one of the biggest takeaways from the Malwani People's Plan has been the participation of young people. Youth collectives have been very strong in enabling that input and realizing and unpacking the plans and unpacking the existing land use and finding out that, hey, my basti is here with 40,000 people, but it's nowhere on the map. So they're launching, missing identity campaigns. So just that act of being able to understand and participate in the process opens up several other very, very engagement opportunities. So I think that's also an important thing. Another, a more local example I want to talk about is something called the Child Protection Committees. Through a resolution of the Maharashtra state government, we have village child protection committees, but also in the urban areas, these have been, institutionalized at the electoral ward level under the ICPS, which is the Integrated Child Protection Scheme. The corporator, the council is a convener and has other local executive officials, but also representation of caregivers and children. And I think, again, Yuva and other groups, notably the Baladhikar Sangharsh Sangathan, a children's collective, has been working very strongly to implement the child protection committees, to really build a safe environment, prevent protection violations, which has become so much important post the pandemic. And again, this direct linkage with the ULB, I think there's a lot of scope to expand that, and scale up these CPCs across the country. I chose to share these three examples because I think they all have a statutory and a legal basis. And these experiments, they provide a foundation, on which to both emphasize how people's collectives, the strength of people's collectives and being driven by local groups, the Shahar Vikas Manch in Nagpur, the Malwani Yuva Parishad in Bombay, or the Baladhikar Sangharsh Sangathan for the child protection committees. Through these sort of collectives, we can actually push even in these more structured legal spaces. But I think we need both. We need the strength of the collective, but we need to make that critical connect. It's not enough for me to just make a manifesto for my basti and work on it. I have to also link with the actual spaces that exist and intelligently and strategically use them towards, the deepening of democracy. And I think finally, just to say, COVID has overtaken our lives, realistically, and also our imagination. This is a time of COVID, but I think it's also the time of increasing hate and sectarian violence, where basic institutions of democracy are being shaken at the foundation, whether it's the courts, the media, even the executive. And in this, shrinking spaces context with profiling, and Jaydev also spoke about technology and the risks of that, impunity we see at the highest levels of power. So I think in this context, what democracy is happening at the local level assumes an entirely new significance. And it is a political question. I think it gives us a huge, bigger impetus to really invest in strengthening democracy at that local level. And I think, whatever horizons we might be able to see for a more equal and just India are visible at that local level. And I think that's where, we want to be. So I'm very glad this conversation is happening today. And I, do hope it grows from strength to strength.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rashni. You have in fact relivened some of my own experience, which, in early 90s, when we started our work on urban governance. Although, the bigger municipalities or bigger cities had the option to go for ward committees, at least as per 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. But nothing was available or still not available for the small and medium-sized municipalities. There is no legal basis for having a Mahalla Samiti. And Nikita was presenting about some of our work on urban governance. And one of the experiences was to support urban resource centers in each of these 50 cities where we have worked. And one thing that we started doing is to strengthen the Mahalla Samiti, engaging them again, Srinivas's example of budget, but also local level planning. How people can involve in solid waste management planning or sanitation, water planning, road planning, electricity, so on and so forth. So in fact, you in a way sort of made me nostalgic about Mahalla Samiti. Thank you so much. Let me, we have been listening mostly from the Indian experiences. Let me now invite Jeff Tendua. Jeff, you have been supporting a large number of initiatives, primarily focusing on social accountability, and in different contexts, in Latin America, in Africa, in many Asian countries. What have been the primary lessons in terms of, institutionalizing and scaling up citizen engagement with municipal government? Jeff.
Well, thank you, Kaustubh. Can you hear me? Just
Yes,
checking.
yes, we can hear you, Jeff.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be reconnecting with you, my colleagues at PRIA, and your network of practitioners and even policymakers. The Gpsa, Global Partnership for Social Accountability, as many of you know, was created explicitly for facilitating platforms for collaboration between citizens and governments in a framework of social accountability. So it's been this reconciling the imperatives of government accountability to citizens with the importance of bringing actual solutions to the table in a collaborative manner. And so we are at 10 years now. I congratulate you at PRIA for 40 years. I salute you and congratulate you for the huge contribution that you've made to citizen empowerment and capacity strengthening of especially civil society and local communities. So we at the World Bank identify three important dimensions of inclusion, which are very well rehearsed: the spatial, looking at providing affordable necessities to our citizens; the social, which considers inclusive participation, especially of the most marginalized groups; and of course, economic, which is to do with creating jobs and so forth, and giving urban residents the opportunity to benefit from growth. And but as we all know, innovations in citizen engagement and inclusion in urban governance, they are all over the place. They are bound, both technological and non-technological. And Jaydev has taken us through some of those technological innovations. But they whether it's structured places that Roshni spoke to for deliberation, citizen juries, citizen assemblies, public auditoriums, or participatory budgeting, citizen budgets, citizen report cards. We use all of these: participatory expenditure tracking, participatory planning, which has been spoken to a lot today, and of course, e-government initiatives, digital platforms, civic technologies, and so forth. We at the Gpsa call collaborative social accountability. We focus on what we're calling collaborative social accountability as an approach to governance that's really trying to bridge citizens and civil society and governments sort of in between the traditional supply and demand dichotomy. And this process engages citizens and communities and civil society groups and public sector institutions in processes that are joint and iterative. And as I said, that bring solutions to jointly identified problems and help to improve accountability and performance, especially in the sectors and in delivery of services. And we know from experience that when these processes are done well in urban governance, they can have a huge payoff. As the research done several years back by the Young Foundation found, governments and local councils that enjoy higher levels of citizen participation generally had stronger communities, more empowered citizenry, had better services for residents were better equipped to support and disadvantaged communities. Back in 2018, Back in 2018, I invited Napoleão Bernardes, the former mayor of the city of Blumenau in Santa Catarina in Brazil, to lead with the keynote address at our 2008 Global Partners Forum at the Gpsa. And he struck me as really understanding the imperative of city government bringing people on board. One of the things he said was opening up government to be informed and influenced by the citizens is one of the defining priorities of our time. And he went on to argue that collaboration of citizens and government, civil society and governments, building their synergies and in his experience, that these contributed to a much more responsive city government. And when they make commitments, they follow them through using charters and getting citizens to monitor and report on what's been accomplished and what has not been accomplished. He described how paving of roads and tackling flooding in the cities, addressing disability priorities and challenges, that how they were enacted in his city through very purposeful engagement of citizens. So we know that it takes leadership, insightful, innovative leadership that reaches out. It also takes an engaged citizenry, but also it takes a strong intermediaries, the role of civil society organizations to foster these processes. The role of government is exemplified in things like participatory budgeting, which, as you know, now abounds in many cities. Of course, despite its varied experiences, it is still around, maybe waning, but it's still around, from Porto Alegre to California and South Africa. But this represents government leadership for social accountability. It was novel and still is novel in many cities around the world. But we know that transformational innovations have also been ushered in by legal frameworks that codify citizen participation. I think, Roshni, you alluded to that, whether it's constitutional provisions and even subsidiary legislation. The city statute of Brazil, for example, that really set parameters of urban policy and mandated participatory processes in the development of urban master plans. In India, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, in African cities, in Ghana, in Malawi and Kenya, we have seen the power of legislation enshrining citizen engagement in legislation and how it has produced so much energy. But I also take the lesson that I can't remember who just said it, but much of it is on paper. That's why it takes intermediaries and organizations that really devote themselves to helping to translate laws into practice. Inclusive governance is not automatic. It doesn't come even with legislation. It has to be folded into the design of initiatives. Collaborative governance approaches have to include perspectives of demographics that are traditionally excluded, and even with provisions of law that says citizens have to participate in health facilities, for example, which a project we supported in towns in South Kivu in Congo, really strong legislation. We supported CODAID, the civil society organization based out of Holland, to use a mixture of social accountability methods. They included citizen charters and community scorecards to enable people to unify their voices and represent their needs in the health facilities that are called CODESAs. And one requirement, for example, was the representation of underserved groups in CODESAs. And we did an evaluation of that project, and that reported that through targeted meetings and access to financial support, people from marginalized community groups participated in CODESA activities. They were able to influence its decisions. A survey that was conducted much later showed that people felt healthier. They faced fewer barriers accessing the health centers, the CODESAs, engaged in fewer catastrophic expenses that are typical for people living in poverty and marginalization, and they have become part of the fabric of society. Out in Dominican Republic, lagging public sector performance, really just troubling underperformance of public sectors that triggered public debates and demands from civil society for better public services and for more participatory governance. These voices grew louder and the authorities responded and created structured spaces for deliberation and for participation, especially in the education sector. There was the creation of what was called the Education Pact that was really central to sustaining education sector reforms in DR, strengthened by a specific program that the Ministry of Education put in place. How is my school doing? That's the translation from Spanish. And we've supported that program. It's a collaborative approach that was known by its introduction of new forms of engagement, bringing in parents and students and civil society and school communities in assessing progress against that Education Pact. So we have to, while celebrating the presence of not just legal frameworks that enshrine participation, but evidence of practice from leaders that make it work and civil society organizations that mediate these practices, we still have to ask how can these practices go to scale? Now, they can go to scale through lateral multiplication of practices. They can go to scale through the embedding of these practices in larger programs and in delivery systems, especially of governments. We in the GPSA use the advantage of being in the World Bank, for example, to mediate the engagement, if you like, support the engagement of civil society organizations in collaborative social accountability with governments, and then use sector delivery systems to take up the good practices and lessons from social accountability that's led by CSOs and make them a part of the government system. In Moldova, the budget forums, the Ministry of Education took them up and multiplied them through the country. In Mozambique, a project that was specifically targeting inclusion of marginalized, extreme poor communities in urban and rural cities, in rural places in Nyasa province and Zambezia province in Mozambique. People afflicted with HIV/AIDS, maternal and child health, and using these public auditoriums, the Ministry of Health took up these practices and embedded them in the broader national health strategy, and a World Bank maternal and child health program picked up these practices and caused them to find ways to scale. This is significant for us because we deal in grants, and these grants go to civil society organizations, and they're small. Yeah, small in the broader scheme of World Bank financing. You're talking $500,000 to $1 million. But of course, for many CSOs, this is a lot of money. But its impact is severely limited if it can't find scale through other delivery systems that are larger. So that's a profound lesson for us in terms of where we go to find scale for viable social accountability practices. We've also learned that, yeah, okay, let me pause.
Thank you, Jeff. I feel guilty, of
don't worry.
Interrupting you. It's sort of full of stories and insights and examples. And thank you so much for taking up this point of scaling up and giving solid examples that how an institution like World Bank can promote social accountability, citizen engagements in its own programs, but also when it works with other governments, can help them to think that how these public programs can scale up citizen participation. Thank you so much, Jay. Let me now invite Akila Shivadas. Akila ji. And Akila ji, you have to unmute. And I continue to encourage our participants to write questions, comments. I could see several insightful comments, and I would encourage our panelists also to respond some of those questions. Akila ji, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Kaustav, and thanks to the co-hosts and to the panelists. Two things I want to preface my presentation with. One is, when we are talking about the citizen engagement, it's already very complex. Everyone recognizes that at the end of the day, there are multiple transactions to do. Both Roshni and Srinivas, highlighted some of their own experiences on the ground in the Indian context. And these are, what we call very structural and systemic barriers. Structural barriers, of course, are extremely entrenched. We have our own set of battles to fight there. And of course, in that, and the highest sort of, barrier is the gender inequality. But the systemic barriers can be really punishing just because there is a jotting or a noting or, some administrative fiat has been issued. It's indelible. And we sort of, sometimes underestimate those challenges. We feel that if we do advocacy at the highest level, if we are able to swing opinions there, we can actually bring about change. Or if we even get budgets going, we can bring about change. But we will be shocked to find that there are sort of, hidden sort of, shall we say, roadblocks for, community engagement. That's the first point I want to raise. It was very clear from the, let's say, the mid-2000, from 2005, 2006 onwards, it became very clear, especially after the Human Development Indexes, the reports began to be, generated by the different state governments. It became very clear that, urban poverty is, something so deep-rooted, and the exclusion and the kind of, shall we say, the levels of neglect, the levels of, willful exclusion is extremely high. So when we are talking about informal spaces, even, in terms of even to make a distinction between what happened during COVID and pre-COVID, is it's at some levels, important, but at some levels, it's somewhere, it assumes that, you required a crisis of this magnitude to be, shocked out of your thing and to actually, confront the issue of the urban poor, to look at the migrant, to see the kind of, what we saw, the spectacles we saw, to be actually, stirred by your conscience. And suddenly you say, yes, there is something called the urban poor. There's something called the migrant. There's somebody, something called a completely sort of disenfranchised citizen. We need to do something. But what was really embedded right from 2006, Costa, became very clear that, this is almost like the twain can never meet. The systems that are formal can never meet the structures that are informal. They're not really informal in terms of settlement, place, space. They're informal in terms of work, identity. They're informal at multiple levels, and they have their own internal, shall we say, their own internal cauldron, so to speak, to also, contend with. It became very clear that two things need to happen. Our own learning on working with the urban poor became very clear that three things have to happen. One, leadership. Two, what we call, organic participation. So if I'm leprosy affected, then I work for my peers. I work for that constituency because I know best what is happening to them. So all of that. So you have your community participation or organic participation. You have your leadership, and the most important, very structured, calibrated mediation. All three are needed. Out of that emerged, for us, a mechanism called the single window. We have set up the single window mechanism across 7 cities across the country. Bangalore is one of them. We work very closely with Janagraha on the vaccine and the work with at the ward level and at the local city level on the recent COVID prevention and vaccination. So in Bangalore is one of them, but other cities are also there. And what are we looking at in terms of the single window? It is not a standalone. It's not an NGO creation, Foster. It's not something that we run as CPAR. We run it in close coordination with all the local stakeholders, including CSOs, CBOs, unions, market associations. All of that is part of that single window structure. And what is that single window trying to do? It's trying to create what is called that level of mediation and facilitation. But how does that happen on a city scale? Or how does it happen even on a zonal scale? Because that settlements are very dense. If you stand outside a settlement, you might imagine that there are about 200 houses there, because you can't really see the inside. But if you step in and you ask somebody, they'll tell you there's 7,000 houses there, not 200. You'll be so much off the mark in terms of understanding the urban poverty or the urban poor. So this entire thing is then supported by what is called a mechanism called the help desk in each slum and settlement. And it could be across about over 100 settlements with a help desk. What is that help desk? Each member represents a constituency. If that settlement is preponderantly, comprising of, let's say, construction workers, rag pickers, domestic workers, then each of them represent one of the constituency. And it is through that process of, facilitation on the ground that the whole process of change was evolved. And what does that mean? Does that mean that, you're like a call center? No, you're not just a call center. You're not just listing demands. You're communicating at every level. And one of the things that we have realized, Kaustav, over the years, that we talk to the top, we talk to the bottom, we rarely deal with the middle. The middle is actually the biggest spoiler and the most resistant to change. They don't want anything that is inconveniencing them. They want to pack their bags at 5 minutes before 5, if they can help it. They don't want to stay a minute later. They're not worried as to what the consequences, what their errors of omission and commission are causing, the kind of devastation it's causing to people, they're not concerned about. They feel extremely, neglected. They feel very inferior. They do not feel sufficiently empowered. It's not about capacity building. It is about a hierarchy that, you have to deal with. And that is where the whole communication is there. But more importantly, there's communication between communities. You'll be surprised to know they live cheek by jowl, but they don't know each other. They don't know their concerns. They don't know where those concerns emerge from. That entire conversation, and most importantly, the conversation with that formal structure. There are local brokers. There are local mediators. There are, very powerful power structures that you have to dismantle to, get yourself a place. So it is that entire process of empowerment. So when you read in fine print a policy or a program or a legislation that actually recognizes citizen engagement, and you do not have your transactions of citizen or community preparedness at different levels and actually influencing day-to-day governance, not at the level of, standing outside a gate and negotiating your rights, but sitting inside and working through that hierarchy and through that structure, your entitlements and rights. And when COVID broke out, when the pandemic broke out, what really helped us, what Roshni and Preeta spoke about, all that community action. Not only was there community action, a lot of that happened, but more than the community action was the what we call a professionalizing of their service. They're no more just volunteers. They're no more just doing as and when needed. They now have become very integral to that process. And as Srinivas said, now the governments also realize that, we need not just participation, not just a chorus, not as and when needed, you arouse the community and, mobilize them. You need, insight, you need perception, you need views, you need what is called, most importantly, that resilience, that element of resilience has to grow. And they have to become integral, not just to COVID, but many other things that are happening side by side, that is threatening their life and existence. So I think these three things about leadership development, facilitation, very, very calibrated, informed. And I just want to make one last point. One of the things that we must understand is that in all of this, what the community does at a daily basis, it garners knowledge about the system. The system is not is not a monster. The system needs to be beaten. The system does not need to be just confronted and coped. It needs to be taken on its own strength. And we need to go a step ahead and say, well, if you can do it, so can I. And that's the knowledge system the community has developed. And conversely, the duty bearers, who used to shun the community, who had even, let's say, implicit fear of them, distrust of them, today, not only respect and, seek their, opinion, but actually see them as part of their system. They don't see them as beneficiaries or applicants or somebody seeking service. They see them as integral to the solution. So I think the single window thing needs to be replicated. There are many, organizations that are keen on taking this on, and we are hoping, to work with a consortium of partners to take this in and to make this, to institutionalize that process across cities and across, geographies.
Thank you, Akilaji. Thank you so much. It's so refreshing to hear you, and especially the point of intermediation, facilitation, that's critical. Let me now invite Rushda. Rushda, you had to wait for so long to speak. Apology for that, but we are much wiser now along with you. So let's hear you, Rushda.
Great. No, thank you for that, Kaustav, and also, of course, to all the fellow panelists. I think a lot of points have been covered in terms of the topic at hand and what is necessary and needed. So before I begin, I just wanted to, of course, thank all of you for inviting me, all the organizers, and maybe talk a little bit about the Bernard Van Leer Foundation and why we do what we do, because that links very nicely to some of the questions that have been raised today. And so basically the Bernard Van Leer Foundation, or BVLF as we like to call ourselves, we are a Netherlands-based foundation headquartered in The Hague. Of course, we've been working in India for a long time, nearly 3 decades. We started working here in 1992. And the foundation works on early childhood development. This is all we do, and this is all we've been doing since 1949, which gives you like the several decades that we've been focusing on a single topic at hand, which makes us one of the earliest funders, but also one of the earliest supporters in the field of early childhood development. One of our core initiatives is called Urban 95. And this is a city scale initiative that is many cities around the world, also in India, are associated with it. And the 95 in the Urban 95 is 95 centimeters, which is the height of a healthy 3-year-old child. So basically, through Urban 95, we ask cities, city leaders, also citizens and others who are key stakeholders in the city, of what would you do differently if you were to look at a city from the height of 95 centimeters, which is the height of a healthy 3-year-old child. And this initiative is quite interesting because it touches upon a few things, some of what Jeff mentioned, which is how can you focus and fold citizen engagement in the design of initiatives. Some of what also was mentioned by some of the other panelists. I think Jaydev mentioned how cities and infrastructure and services are deeply gendered. So this particular initiative tries to get to the core of how you can bring about change in many ways. This is a built environment program, but of course to include and build demand bottom up as well, by working directly with the city government, but also through engaging citizens. So the reason I mention that is that, of course, a lot of things have been discussed conceptually, but perhaps a few examples in terms of some of the things that we are doing, but more in terms of what cities and citizens are doing might be good illustration of how things can move. And there are three examples in particular under Urban 95. One example is pre-pandemic. I know a lot has been said about COVID-19. Others are more recent, but I'm presenting that example with the hope that eventually we will emerge out of COVID-19, fingers crossed. So one example I think you, Kaustav and Rajesh, are deeply aware of, which was under the Smart Cities challenge that was conducted. Bhubaneswar is a city that we've been working with closely over several years, in fact, several decades. And when they were participating in the Smart Cities Challenge, they actually engaged a lot with their citizens in a very concrete way in terms of bringing good ideas into their proposals. And so therefore, this idea of folding the citizen engagement in the design of initiatives was something that we saw on the ground in Bhubaneswar. Of course, a lot of it was pressure from top down in terms of ranking and competition, but it's still a good model for cities to understand that engaging citizenry through consultations and in innovative ways is key to strengthening their own work and services and quality of life. It's also the key to scaling and institutionalization, which is also the topic at hand. Of course, after the Smart Cities Challenge, a lot of the citizen engagement piece, as far as we know, didn't stick as much, but it did to a large extent in Bhubaneswar because that fabric of engagement was already there and the city very smartly built upon it using this challenge process as a point of engaging citizens in a very concrete way. The other example that I wanted to talk about is something that we are calling the Nurturing Neighborhoods Challenge. And this is something that is in partnership with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, the Bernard Vanlier Foundation and technical partner are also associated with it. But more importantly, a lot of cities are associated with it as an extension of Urban 95. And all of us have learned from the Smart Cities experience, and of course, citizen engagement is key, but how do you do it in a sustained manner over time if it is built into the design of an initiative? Under this challenge, and I think, again, this was mentioned by a lot of panelists, the focus is on neighborhoods and wards, which we find are conducive to engaging communities local to the area, including a lot of low-income communities, migrant populations, people living in slums and informal settlements and so on. And the theme throughout in terms of the design of this initiative and challenge process is the engagement and co-creation is key. Of course, we've seen a lot of push by the cities themselves, but we are also seeing a lot of interesting engagement with frontline workforce. Because we work with the topic at hand is early childhood, young children and their caregivers, frontline workers, Anganwadi workers, ASHA workers, and so on are quite involved in offering feedback and becoming part of the process, which are interesting ways to engage with a different demographic. So when we talk about citizens in general, of course, the frontline workers are also part of the citizenry. The other thing we realized is that data, of course, is critical. And sometimes at the neighborhood scale, to make this change, to do a mapping of who is impacted, but also observe how public spaces are being used is critical. And this can all feed into an engagement process with the citizens that are part of those communities. And cities are learning that. Of course, it's a longer process, but this is something that we are utilizing. And when I say we, I do mean cities and other partners on the ground that are at the forefront of this. Of course, the COVID-19 situation made things difficult. A lot was planned, a lot couldn't happen. But I'll just illustrate one particular example that happened under the Nurturing Neighborhoods Challenge with Rourkela, where the city and citizen groups engaged a lot of the citizens in a particular low-income area. And one of the informal settlements is actually called a leprosy colony. But in terms of engaging with them, what came out was 2 parks and playgrounds that were built near the area to respond to the needs of the citizens. One last example, I know time, so I'll just mention the cities of Pune and Udaipur, where we work very closely, where a lot of focus is on involving citizens through on the maintenance part of infrastructure. So the ownership and maintenance part of infrastructure, where a lot of resident welfare associations, local area committees come into play. And this is something that is an interesting example where it's easier to have people coalesce around a particular piece of infrastructure or built environment and continue to engage them in having a say in how public spaces, parks and playgrounds are utilized in that area. So I'll end with just one note, which is that, of course, the focus has to be, and for us also, is on scale and sustainability and institutionalization. We also don't have the answer. We are learning as we go along, but we are seeing cities take the lead in regular consultations and also seeing common areas of convergence that are serving as galvanizing forces, professional associations, RWAs, etc. And so, of course, a lot more needs to be done to build trust and peer-to-peer learning. And of course, policy level changes are critical. But these are just some examples which are at the beginning of some of what we touched upon today. So thank you so much, and back to you, Costa.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rose. They're so fascinating examples. And of course, we have worked together on promoting citizen participation in the visioning and planning of the smart city processes. But I wish we could continue that work even after that. Right now, the level of we have several questions around that. I know that we have already sort of crossed the time limit. I wish I could invite again Prita and Jaydev and others, and even also some of the participants. But I have been a terrible timekeeper, so apology for that. Let me now invite Dr. Rajesh Tandon. Rajesh bhai, you have listened to 7 speakers and also some of the comments and insights from our participants through polls and also some word clouds. What are your takeaways? I'm not asking you to summarize it, but what are your key takeaways?
Well, I am deeply inspired as well as humbled by the presentations we have heard, including the questions and comments in the chat box that have been going on from all of you. Thank you very much. It has highlighted a number of things. The first, of course, is that what we knew before the pandemic has been graphically illustrated during the pandemic, that cities in India and many southern contexts are highly unequal societies. It's not just income inequality or wealth inequality, it's also inequality in terms of conditions of your life and living, and the scale of human suffering that has happened during the pandemic in the cities has reinforced this notion that urban informality is not merely a concept, but it is a living reality for generations of people who were born in a way on the pavement and grow old on the pavement, and that so the participation for them is not about sitting in a council meeting. Participation for them is struggle for survival. And The second reality that has slowly creeped in the cities is privatization of basic services, which became very evident and has become increasingly more evident with the delivery boys running amok all over the cities. That water, electricity, rental housing, uh, you know, practically a sanitation facility, uh, all services, healthcare, education, a lot of that has been gradually privatized in the last 20, 30 years in many of our cities. And the privatization follows two parallel tracks. Economists talk about this V shape, one is the privatization of fancy global international schools and hospitals and sort of gated communities. Um, Another is the privatization for the poor housing, the sort of the six in a room and very poor quality what are called schools in shanties and local sort of private health providers. So I think in a way citizen participation is has to contend with the inequality and the privatization forces that have moved together in the last 2-3 decades. And in the Indian context, therefore, the institutional spaces which are available, which I think several speakers have emphasized, we need institutional spaces. Board committee is only one example of that. Mohalla committee is another. But despite the fact that these models or these formal institutional spaces have been available, they haven't been activated because we don't have Yuvas and Janagres and Sifars in each of our 10,000 cities in this country. We don't have. And that, to my mind, is the failure of civil society in India. That's a failure of civil society to engage with urban space, urban poverty, in the same way that they were engaging with rural for many years. And the point that Jaydev was making is very, very significant now, because while it was perhaps not so visible during the pandemic, before the pandemic, it has become so. And evictions, 20 years ago, we used to fight evictions. Nowadays, we accept them. We take it as part of urbanization. Why so? Why so? Why are the rights of people being trampled with in the name of demands of us who are champions of participation, who are right and a constitutional mandate to find a way to go beyond the technocratic digital fixes to which many of our speakers have referred to, because just creating an app is not enabling participation. And this is where social mobilization, awareness generation, forming settlement level organizations, building connection between settlements, as many people have said, Akila and Roshni and others, are important. The last thing I want to say in this is that cities beyond the Bangalores and the Bhubaneswars and Punes, please, Mumbai's, the cities in this country lack in human and institutional capacity to sustain participation. That capacity was built by 2-3 decades of work since 1980 in our rural development programs, largely because it was demanded by civil society and communities, but that capacity hasn't been built in urban institutions and urban local bodies. And that capacity is managed through the kind of smart city participation we saw through short-term consultants focusing on websites, and then those websites disappear after city has been declared smart and receives the grant. So I feel that civil society's role, intermediation role, facilitation role, mobilization role, and pressure building role is critical. I hope the lessons from this stimulate us to take this forward, as almost all of our speakers have hinted at that. So let me stop here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajesh Bhai. And it's such a paradox when you say that there is lack of capacity in the cities. We are sitting on several lakhs of educational institutions, training institutions. All of us are located in the cities. Several 100,000 NGOs are located, and their head offices are in cities, but we don't have the necessary human capacities to engage with the governance institution. So at some point in time, not at some point in time, rather urgently, we need to address these paradoxes and address this question of inequalities very squarely. Thank you so much for being with us, staying for the entire session. I want to reiterate our thank you to Jaydev, Preeta, Srinivas, Rashni, Jeff, Akila, and Rushda, and also two institutions which have partnered with us, Bridgespan India and Janagraha. Thank you for this partnership and all your support. We'll be preparing a short report, and the recordings of this conversation will also be made available on Priya website. So please feel free to share with your colleagues and the people who you think might be benefited from this discussion. And thank you so much. We'll be in touch with you for sure. Have a good evening. Thank you so much.